Calder?
I have no idea.
Maybe it's a better.
All right, here we go. Sweetly, Lord, have we heard thee calling? Come, follow me. And we see where the footprints falling lead us to thee. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway known. We will follow the steps of Jesus wherever they go. Though they lead on the cold dark mountains, sleeping as sheep, or along the slow woods mountains, helping the weak. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway known. We will follow the steps of Jesus wherever they go. Then at last, when on high He sees us, our journey done, we will westward the steps of Jesus in darkness strong. Footsteps of Jesus that make the pathway known. We will follow the steps of Jesus wherever they go. All right, so before I leave and go with the kiddos, and if he forgets, we are fixing to have a grandbaby. Like, she's due tomorrow. Oh, and we're really surprised that little Mandy is not here yet. So, so be in prayer for Heather. Our first little granddaughter, she had five weeks early, I believe. So this one is fully cooking. So we just want to have a safe birth and everything is good to go. She's due May 2nd. Yeah, May 2nd. So, lots of babies this year.
Holy cow, that's pretty good.
Where is Scott? Is he sick?
Scott is at the Frio at the Albans Academy working on his sermons. So, yeah, for the rest of the year.
He's not gonna be gone the rest of the year.
No. He's just gone through it next Tuesday, I think.
I wish I could do that and write all my sermons for the next year and get it done. Just doesn't work for me. So she mentioned that my granddaughter's going to be born, and they're naming her Mandy. My son wants to give her a middle name of Lorian. My daughter-in-law is not going for it, so it's not going to happen. So, anybody have any prayer requests? Any updates?
I talked to Vesta about 5 o'clock this afternoon. Bob is doing a little better.
Okay.
He's still not clear from COVID, though. Mentally, he is getting better. They think that his loss of memory and that kind of thing was caused from too much CO2 in his bloodstream.
Okay.
Okay, and, but Jim talked to him today too, but he wasn't real clear when Jim talked to him.
And he confessed that to Vesta. He said, I don't think I talked very good to him.
Vesta's daughter is here. They went up yesterday to see him and spend some time with him, but doing that knocked her for a loop, and she's been in bed all day today. So
Okay.
she's not feeling well either, and her daughter was in emergency with bronchitis.
So prayers for Bob and Vesta.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Any other? Yes, sir.
I have a friend in Georgia who's 46 years old, And when she was 16, she got hit by a truck going 45 miles an hour. And she was in a coma for a month. And so she's completely paralyzed.
Okay.
And she doesn't even talk. She goes, But she can walk. But lately she cannot walk because she has water or fluid on top of her brain. And it's keeping her from walking. So next Tuesday, they're going to have an operation for her and put a shunt in her mama says.
Okay.
So that will allow her to walk. So all I'm asking is prayer for the doctors and for her.
What's her name?
Terry Lynn.
Terry Lynn. Okay. All right.
Thorpe. Thorpe is her last name.
Terry Thorpe.
Lynn Thorpe.
Terry Lynn Thorpe. Okay.
Georgia.
Maria's taking the notes. So, okay. Anybody else? Okay. Like I said, I have one praise. I've got a granddaughter due any day now. And if you all want to pray for Marcy and I, we'll be leaving next Friday to go on our little vacation. So.
Well, so you want to do that?
Yes, we're sure.
They're warning people not to take cruises right now.
Of course, they're warning people not to go to Walmart, too. So, you know, that's the way we look at it. God will take care of us. So, what's that?
Linda Bradley.
Linda Bradley.
She's had stroke.
Okay, Linda Bradley had a stroke. Okay. All righty. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for this opportunity to come together to study your word, Lord, and just that we can gather together as prayer warriors and pray for these needs. We ask that you just lift up each one of these people, and Lord, just not only them, but the people around them, that they can get through this too, Lord. We know you have grace for all situations. We just ask you give it liberally. We just ask you to be with me as I give this message tonight. Lord, just open the hearts, open my mouth to give the right message, and open the hearts to receive it. We just ask all this in Jesus' precious name. Amen. All right. Last time we were together was November 23rd. The only reason I have that is that's the date. I date all my sermons and my lessons so that I'm preaching at two different churches and doing Bible study at one of them. And I'm not ashamed to admit I recycle things. So I have to keep meticulous notes so that I don't actually preach the same message to the same group.
Most of us wouldn't recognize
I
that.
know, and I was going to say, most of the people that listen to me are older than me, so they wouldn't know the difference anyway. But I'm not going to say that. I'll let Jim say that. So, last time we were together, we went through Daniel 4. We saw Nebuchadnezzar tell the story of how he had a dream, and Daniel interpreted that dream for him. And that dream contained a warning. It said, God warned Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to punish you. And I'm going to teach you a lesson. And Daniel said, be careful, Nebuchadnezzar. And we saw that Daniel actually liked Nebuchadnezzar and didn't want to see him fall. But Nebuchadnezzar was out on his balcony and started getting full of himself and said, look at my kingdom. I'm responsible for this. I built all this. And God said, that's it. And for 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar went out in the wilderness, lived in the fields, eating grass, living like an animal. And at the end of the 7 years, God gave Nebuchadnezzar back his wits. And what did Nebuchadnezzar, the first thing he did? Started praising God and saying, thank you, Lord. Thank you for letting me come back. And he sent a letter to the entire world saying, the God of Israel is the God of this universe. And he submitted himself to God. So I think he came to salvation. That's my opinion. But today we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar is no longer the king. A man named Belshazzar is now king. Now, if I were writing these stories, and they're not stories, they're history, but if I were arranging it, I would not have had a king named Belshazzar, because what's Daniel's name? Babylonian name. Belteshazzar. Okay, it's just confusing, okay? There's too many Johns in the New Testament, too many Judases. We just need to get these names straight, right, Lord? Not really. I'm just saying. But Belshazzar is the king. Now, secular historians and critics really want to discredit the book of Daniel. They want to say that Daniel was written much later than it actually was. They want to be able to criticize Daniel, put any doubt they can on the book of Daniel. The thing is as we go through Daniel, we see prophecies where Daniel made prophecies hundreds of years before their fulfillment. In this case, probably about 40 years before their fulfillment. And he prophesied, and these events came true. His prophecies were so accurate and so clear as to how they came true that if they were written, when they were written, they had to have been written with divine or with supernatural help. There's no way that someone could have made the predictions and the prophecies that came true. So they want those to be disproved. Now you've got a lot of people that are Christians, that are, more liberal Christians. They don't want the book of Daniel to be true because the prophecies that haven't come true yet in the book of Daniel, they don't like them. So if they can discredit the book of Daniel, then those things may not be true. So when we come to, I mentioned that I'm going to be teaching you all April 29th through June the 7th or 8th when Scott goes on his sabbatical. So I told Casey earlier. So I will actually finish the book of Daniel maybe this year. So we've been on this journey for over a year now. And I don't see how we can be because Casey always says I talk too fast. So if I am, why are we still here? So don't miss out on April, May, and June when I'm subbing for Scott if you want to hear some of these future prophecies. So there's been a lot of controversy amongst scholars about Daniel's claim that Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. Historians for a long time thought that Nebuchadnezzar was the last king. Critics used to claim Belshazzar was a fictional character that the writer of the book of Daniel made up. Now, subsequent discoveries in archaeology have shown that Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's father and that they were co-regents of Babylon. Belshazzar was in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was in another location. So they failed to discredit the book of Daniel with those charges. So now they're looking for another way. And they look at the book of Daniel and they say they wanted to find another way to attack it. 6 times in Daniel, we see that Nebuchadnezzar was called Belshazzar's father. One time he's called the son of Nebuchadnezzar. How do we resolve this? The Bible isn't clear exactly how this came about, but there's a number of explanations. In the ancient Near East, when you looked at predecessors, you might say that Nebuchadnezzar was the predecessor father, and Belshazzar was his successor son. This is not uncommon. Another possibility that I think is the real likely truth is that when you talk about father and son, a grandfather can be called father, and a grandson can be called son. And we see that throughout all of Israel, and that's done a lot. So I believe that what it is Nebuchadnezzar is Belshazzar's father. Nebuchadnezzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son. So Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So one other theory that I just want to throw out there is that Nebuchadnezzar married one of the daughters of Nebuchadnezzar, which would then make Belshazzar his grandson, and thus be called his son, and Nebuchadnezzar be called his father. The thing is, it doesn't matter. We know that no matter how the verbiage comes out, that there was a relationship. And the only 2 people that are important in this story are Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, because they're mentioned. So there's no error in the book of Daniel. So if you turn to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. King Belshazzar is having a massive banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. These types of feasts were not uncommon. In the ancient Near East, there's stories of some leaders having 15,000 people come to banquets like this. These banquets lasted and lasted and lasted. And as the wine flowed, people would become drunker and drunker, and they usually ended up in orgies. They ended up in all kinds of nasty things. But why would Belshazzar have this big banquet? Well, we know at the time that this occurred, the Persian army, and the Persians and the Medes was surrounding Babylon. Babylon was a very well-protected city. The walls were 45 feet high, 25 feet thick. They were pretty much impregnable. And they were pretty safe as long as they had food. They could survive the siege, and they were going to be in there. But previously, just before this, a bunch of the Babylonian army had been wiped out by the Medes and the Persians. Nebuchadnezzar had fled. He was on the lam. He was running. So Belshazzar can't feel very good about his position. He may be safe behind the walls of Babylon, but his time is, he's lost most of his kingdom. He doesn't rule the world anymore. So why would he do this? He holds the feast to put the nobles at ease. Hey, it's all okay. Let's have a big party and celebrate. And so they start doing this. He wants to calm things down. Say, hey, we're under siege, but it's no big deal. We're all okay. And those are the people he needs to support. So, do you remember in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar puffed himself up and didn't recognize that his rule came from God? Well, we're going to see kind of the same thing with Belshazzar. Starting in verse 2, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver cups that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets they had taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and of bronze and of iron and wood and stone. So Belshazzar is committing a tremendous act of blasphemy here. He's taken these artifacts from the temple in Jerusalem, and he's basically mocking God. And they're drinking wine, and now they're toasting the Babylonian gods. 50 years ago, Nebuchadnezzar had taken these artifacts, but apparently they've been just locked up. So when they do this, how do you think God's going to respond? Well, he responds in this way. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later when we apply it to ourselves. Do people blaspheme God today? And God doesn't necessarily, what Jim said, pop them. But this is how he got responded in this case. So I want to point out something here. Let's go back. Belshazzar was showing his people that the gods of Babylon were superior to the gods of Israel. I want you to point something out to you here. Daniel isn't necessarily chronological, because chapter 7 describes a vision Daniel had during Belshazzar's first year as king. Chapter 8 describes a vision Daniel had during Belshazzar's third year as king. We think this is about 20 years into the reign of Belshazzar. So it's not necessarily chronological, but both of those prophecies predicted the fall of Babylon and the fall of the empire. Belshazzar might have been aware of these. Isaiah, 150 years before this, had predicted the fall of Babylon. He might have been aware of this also. So we're going to read in a little bit what his real motivation was, but we know that he was aware of these prophecies, and he was trying to say, we're not going to be wiped out. I want to defy the God of Israel. So verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched as the hand wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Suddenly, at the height of Belshazzar's blasphemy, a hand appears and starts marking the wall. At the height of his drunkenness, the height of all the immorality, this message starts getting written. We know from archaeology, the way they built these walls, it says plaster, but a lot of these walls were gypsum and chalk. So they were meant to be written on. They could be written on very easily. And most of them were white, so anything that came on there would be very clear. But I want you to notice, it also says that the light was right next to the lamp. So it was very clear what the words were. So the Hebrew, though, it says Belshazzar turns pale and his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The Hebrew is amazing here because it says the joints of his loins gave way. I kind of like that. You ever been that scared?
Yeah.
Yeah, just collapsed. So verse 7, the king called out for the enchanters, the astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew even more pale. His nobles were baffled. So he calls in the wisest men in his kingdom. They can't say what it is. The Hebrew actually says he called out loudly. So I can see him screaming at the top of his voice, bring me these people. I need to know what this message says. So he offers a reward. Dressed in purple, which makes him royalty, receive a gold chain, and be placed as the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Many people think that this shows that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar would have been the preeminent, then Belshazzar, and then whoever he appoints. And so he's going to appoint this person. But Belshazzar becomes even more terrified. Verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have been of keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what this writing means." Who is this queen? Well, she comes from outside the banquet hall, right? We're going to see in another verse in a minute that all of Belshazzar's wives and concubines were already in the banquet hall, so she can't be one of those. So who is this queen? Well, she seems to know a lot about Daniel. So a lot of people guess that she was probably a wife of Nebuchadnezzar, or has been around, or maybe Nebuchadnezzar, but she's been around for a long, long time in the palace, right? And if she was merely a wife, would she have come in and said, walked right in so boldly and said, "Don't be so alarmed"? And if she looks at him and says, "Don't look so pale"? Now, who's going to say that to a king like that? His mother, exactly. Yeah, or his grandma. It's going to be someone up that matriarchal chain. So that's why we think it was that.
My Bible says it was his mother.
Was it his mother? I'll have to look at that. But she knows of Daniel's past actions and successes, and she comes in to offer advice. So, verse 13, so Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel of the exiles of my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and the enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you were able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing, tell me what it means. You will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in your kingdom." A couple things to notice here. First, Belshazzar has never met Daniel because he has to ask him, "Are you Daniel?" Now, I don't doubt that he's probably heard stories of Daniel. I mean, if your father or grandfather, whatever the case may be, had spent 7 years out in the wilderness and living like an animal, you might be aware of who had prophesied that and interpreted his dream for him. So you got to remember, he's pale, he's terrified. He may not have remembered Daniel, and that's where his mother or grandmother comes in and tells him. But first thing he does is he says, he reminds him, "You're from Judah." Why would he do that? Why would you think he would do that? He could have done it for a couple of reasons. One was to intimidate Daniel and remind him, "You're a slave, so you better be answering my questions and doing what I tell you to do." Secondly, it may be that he's still kind of in shock and he realizes he's just blasphemed the God of Israel. And he says, you're an Israelite. I just blasphemed the God of Israel, so you're probably going to understand what this says. But then he starts to butter Daniel up. I hear you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. He then says, my wise men can't read the writing on the wall. If you read it, you will be greatly rewarded. Doesn't this sound familiar? Isn't that exactly what happened with Nebuchadnezzar when he had his dream? In that dream where he made the prophecy about the 4 coming kingdoms? And he's brought in under threat of death, a little bit different, but he's offered, what is his reward? He ends up being one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. So, when Daniel interpreted that first dream, he was probably in his teens, maybe 20. Now he's probably about 60 or 62, according to the commentators I read. So they think it's about 40 years have passed. So Daniel might be a little bit more mature, a little bit more solid in his faith. Not that he was lacking in faith before, but he's going to be a little bit more devout. So what's Daniel's answer in verse 17? Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Daniel refuses the gift and says, give them to someone else. I think he did this because he wanted to show that God's services are not for sale. I've got this insight. I'm not going to sell what God gives me. Now, I want to say something bold here that may be controversial, but I have a problem when pastors in churches sell sermons given from the pulpit. Now, if you're giving them on a CD and charging for the cost, that's one thing. But if you've got a pastor that, oh, you want this sermon series? Send us $65. I have a real problem with that. You're selling your service to God. That's just not right. It's not correct. It's not what should happen. So I think that part of the reason is he refused it. Now, when he said, give the rewards to someone else, I really believe that was a sarcastic answer that Daniel gave to Belshazzar. Reason I believe that is, I'm going to make you the 3rd most powerful man in the kingdom. Well, Daniel's walked in. What does he see on the wall? The writing. God's already given him the answer, and he knows what it says. So he knows that Belshazzar's on his way out. So, yeah, you can make me 3rd most powerful in the kingdom. For how long? It's going to be a short-term appointment, you know. Kind of like getting an appointment as the president in January, you know, right before he's going out of office. It's just not going to mean a whole lot. So, Daniel's about to read the riot act to Belshazzar. He's about to give Belshazzar a history lesson and a theology lesson. Now, I want you to notice something. How did Daniel interact with Nebuchadnezzar? With respect. You know, he treated Nebuchadnezzar with respect. He treated him as someone who is appointed by God to be king. What is Daniel's attitude towards Belshazzar? We're going to read what he says to him. It's contempt, and it's looking down on him because he knows he's about to be ousted. Verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Verse 19, because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations of men and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. Notice what it says at the start of verse 18. The Most High God made your father the ruler of the world. He said, only reason Nebuchadnezzar was king was because God made him king. Because of this, God gave him glory and splendor. God gave him all the power he had. He put to death, he had the power to put to death who he wanted to put to death. He could promote who he wanted. He could humble who he wanted. This is all because God in heaven is sovereign and chooses the rulers of the world. Hold that thought. Now, for a little more history and theology. Verse 20, but when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. This is talking about Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them who he wishes. Your father was arrogant and became hardened, got too proud, and God knocked him off his throne. He went in the wilderness, lived like an animal for 7 years. He didn't regain his position until God gave him grace to come back to his senses and acknowledge that God is God. Verse 22, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. So, I said earlier, Belshazzar knew the story. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Remember I said we get into his real motivation? You've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank for wine from them. You praised the gods of silver, gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all of your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Daniel tells Belshazzar that your crime is so much greater than Nebuchadnezzar's. You not only just had pride in your heart, you defied God. You blasphemed the God of the universe. You did this deliberately. You did this to show your nobles that you were more powerful than these gods that are out there. Now, don't forget this situation. Where's Daniel? He's in this courthouse, or this ballroom, or hall with Belshazzar and all of his men, all of his nobles, probably dozens of armed guards and armed men there. What could Belshazzar have done at any point? You're done. But Daniel's not being polite. Daniel's being kind of, like I said, disrespectful. He's saying, you, and why is he? Because he's mad that God has been profaned. So Daniel now is going to read the writing on the wall. Verse 25. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel, parsin. This is what the words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Not is going to bring it to an end, has brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Verse 29, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, and a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Even though he refused the awards, what happened? He was given the chain and the purple clothes, and he was named third highest ruler in the kingdom. Whoop-de-doo lasted for what, about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, whatever, till he was put there. Verse 31 in the Medes' takeover of the kingdom fulfills part of the prophecy in Daniel 2, where it was predicted. The account of the fall of Babylon is verified in all kinds of secular historical documents. We know that it occurred right about 539 BC. Actually, a lot of scholars believe they have the exact date. It was in October. So, what does this mean? This event that occurred 539 BC. What does it have to do with us today? What can we learn from this?
I'm still in control.
Very good. God is still in control. God picks the rulers of this earth. He did so back then.
Just so today.
He does so today. All through Daniel, we see this. Daniel 2:21. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and he sets up kings. In verse 37 of Daniel 2, you, O king, the king of kings, to whom God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and the might and the glory. He says, I put you in this power. Daniel 2:39-40. 39, another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks into pieces. He's telling Nebuchadnezzar in that chapter 2, you're going to be replaced by a kingdom They're going to be replaced by a kingdom, and they're going to be replaced by a kingdom. And you know what? I'm putting them all in there. I'm in charge. I'm not only predicting it, I'm going to make it happen. So, how does God deal with kings and rulers? According to his purposes.
He is sovereign.
He is sovereign. Ooh, are you looking at my notes? God is sovereign and his will is done. It's right there in my notes. Okay, so God is sovereign. He's going to put those rulers and leaders in. So, throughout the Bible, we see where God picked the kings of Israel. He'd let them, some of them rule, or some of them evil, but he still let them rule for his purposes. We see in Jeremiah, God actually raised up the Babylonians to come in and be a curse on Israel. And Jeremiah was saying, yeah, but they're evil. What are you going to do about that? He goes, don't worry, I'm going to take care of them. What did he do? He took care of them. God is in control. God is sovereign. So does he still do this? Romans 13, verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted, by God. Before you answer the next question, I want you to remember that I've talked to many of you outside of this hall, and I've talked to you, and we've carried on lots of conversations. How many of you have ever questioned God's wisdom in choosing the leaders in this country or around the world?
Well, there was one time about a year ago.
I just throw that out there, and I brought that up because I have political conversations with some of these guys. And yes, we do. We start criticizing, why is God doing this? Why is God doing that? Well, that's okay, I think. Or it's okay to question the questionable acts of these leaders. But we should never question God's sovereignty in putting them there. And that God has a reason for what he does. Okay, if we read on in Romans 13, you know what it says in about verse 4 of chapter 13? It says, God puts the leaders in to keep the peace, to protect the people. Do they always do that? No. And God will deal with that. How many of y'all have ever, you've heard of the government in China? It's repressive, it's overbearing, it's, corrupt, it's all this and that. But both times I was in China, I would go walking around at night in the streets of those towns and never once even thought about worrying about someone mugging me. You may laugh, and we remember, where was it, Taiwan, where the young man keyed the car, and they were going to cane him. The government was doing its job there. Maybe we don't approve of what they were doing, but law and order was being maintained. So that's what God puts the governments in. Now, those leaders are going to have to answer to God as to how they do that. But God is in control. Is God sovereign or not? This does not just apply to our rulers. This applies to our daily lives. Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. You believe that?
Did not say all things are good.
No, he said they're all called for work together for good. We've heard the story. For one of a nail, the shoe was lost. For one of the shoe, the horse was lost. For one of the horse, the rider was lost. For one of the rider, the battle was lost. For one of the battle, the war was lost. How many of y'all have ever heard of Bill Vukovic? Y'all aren't that old. I was figuring someone here would remember. He was a NASCAR driver. He rode in the Indy 500 back in the 50s, 60s. Okay? He was one of the greatest race car drivers of his era, and he was killed in a crash in the Indianapolis 500. The cause was later isolated to the failure of a cotter pin that cost 10 cents. Was that minor little detail out of God's control? Did that crash occur and God go, oh man, I had something for Bill to do? No, God was in control of it. We can take it that everything that occurs in our life, death, sickness, car accidents, everything is under God's control, and he has a purpose in it. You know, I've told you my testimony that back in 2014, 2015, when I hit rock bottom, I was down and out, and it wasn't till God said, "Are you my child or not?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm your child, Lord." And he says, "Then get off your butt." That's when I started going to seminary. That's when I really rededicated my life to Christ and began to serve him. God has a plan for every single person. There's a verse, I believe it's one of the Proverbs, that says that our days are numbered, or it's a psalm, one of our days are numbered. He knows. It's not like it's contingent. He already knows when each of us is going to go. So let me ask you this. God had a plan and a mission for the Apostle Paul. Could someone have killed Paul before his conversion? God go, now I got to find someone to replace him. No, he brought him about. Someone couldn't have kept him from doing this. We've been talking about the nativity. Could Herod have actually succeeded in killing the baby Jesus? No, God's in control. 2,000, you may not like what occurs from time to time, but we got to take the view that God's control is for our own good. We may not understand it. We may not even like it sometimes, but what do? Look at it in awe and just watch the tapestry. Go ahead.
The word nevertheless comes into play.
Nevertheless, it's funny you say that. I had an ex-brother-in-law, and he had a son who was mixed up in drugs. And he said, in the counseling, they said, nevertheless became the magic word. Let him talk. Nevertheless, here's what's going to happen. Nevertheless. Anyway, 2,639 years ago, God was in control when he removed Belshazzar from his position. He has been in control of the placement of every ruler throughout all of history. Something else I want to bring up is, why didn't God discipline all leaders the way he disciplined Belshazzar? Why doesn't he discipline the same way?
His sovereignty.
His sovereignty, because it's his own good will and his own good purposes. So, my notes here say, I'm going to say, I don't know. He's going to exact justice in his own time. God tells us justice is mine. We're not to seek vengeance, but rather to love and forgive our enemies. So God's sovereignty, though, and I'm going to go here, is we've talked about it, what about election? Does God sovereignly choose who's going to come to believe in him and who's not? I'm not going to give you the answer because it's beyond me. But the Bible's pretty clear that it says God chooses. But it also says anybody, whoever believes, can believe. So how does that all work? It's beyond my pay grade. But we have to realize that if we're born-again Christians, God chose us. How that works, I'm not sure, but God did choose us. What does that do to us? It placed an obligation onto us. He chose us. Why did he choose us? KC, did you deserve it? No. Jim, I know I didn't. But while we were yet sinners, he chose us and chose to allow us to become saved. He gave us the grace. He gave us the faith. He gave us the willingness to turn to him. Nothing we can do, but we can't boast about it. It's all the work of God. John 6:37 says, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. So we can take that sovereignty and know that we are saved because of that. Now, I'm going to take it to the next level because some people say, well, if that's the case, then I don't have to witness. God will bring whoever he's going to bring to Christ, and I don't have to worry about it. I'm going to quote Scott Jones, malarkey. Okay? It takes the pressure off of us. How many of y'all have ever been worried about witnessing someone and messing it up? Yeah. Guess what? You can't mess it up. It's all the work of God. So get out there and do the job. If you're willing, God will use you. And you know what? He wants to use us. He wants us to be a part of it. I'll tell you the most emotional thing you can ever do is to lead someone to Christ. Not because you feel puffed up and proud of yourself, because you are so humble that God used you, knowing how bad you are. What did Paul say? I'm the chief of sinners. Paul's wrong. I mean, that's just an error in the Bible because I'm the chief of sinners right here. Well, we can argue about it someday. But I don't deserve that honor, but he gives us that honor. So we need to take that. So what I want us to get out of this passage is God is sovereign, and God will take care of his own. Belshazzar blasphemed him. We look around the world, we see people blaspheming God right and left. We see rulers in our own country blaspheming God right and left. Don't worry about it. God will take care of it his way in his time, and we don't need to get ulcers over it. I've shared with you guys before, I haven't watched the news since the day after the election last year. You can laugh, or year before last. Do you realize it's been a year and a half, or a year and 3 months since that election? I haven't watched the news since it. Now I do read my website, different news sites, but my stomach stopped hurting. I've stopped walking around like this all the time. Because you know what? I read Romans 13. God's going to pick who our leaders are. We just don't need to worry about it. When we have trials in our lives, God is giving us those trials. God is sovereign. Let's just give him his sovereignty and just bow in awe at what he's going to accomplish with what he does. Father, thank you so much for today, Lord. Thank you for this message. Lord, we need to hear it because we're living in a troubled time. And we just need to know that even though it seems like the world is out of control, it's all going the way you want it to go. And it's all for your purposes, Lord. And your will be accomplished on earth just as it is in heaven, Lord. We just ask that you just give us that patience, give us that understanding, give us that peace that we can just look at your sovereignty. We just ask all this in Jesus' holy, precious name. Amen.